In July 2009, a group of 18 hikers embarked on what was supposed to be a 3-day-long, brisk summer hiking trip. However, 8 members of the group would end up never coming back, freezing to death despite it being the middle of summer. How could this be possible? What mistakes were made that resulted in their deaths? This is the story of the Tomuraushi mountain disaster. Tomuraushi Mountain is part of the Daisetsuzan mountain range, located in the center of Hokkaido, the northern island of Japan. Although its altitude is only a little over 2,100 meters, or 7,000 feet, due to its remote location, facilities are limited, with only minimal shelters along the way. Temperatures can get quite low. Even during the day in summertime, it can drop to around 10 degrees Celsius, or 50 degrees Fahrenheit. In the summer of 2009, a tour company by the name of Amuse Travel was conducting a tour to traverse Tomuraushi Mountain, along with some other mountains in the area. Their group consisted of 18 people in total, 3 guides and 15 guests, most of them in their 60s. There were no requirements in terms of experience to participate in this tour. As a result, there were some guests in the group who were relatively new to hiking and mountain climbing in general. On July 13th, the group arrives at a nearby airport and takes a bus to the hiking route, where they would spend the night. The guides checked the weather report that night, which mentioned the weather would be fine on the next day, but would get worse on the days afterward. Although the guides were well aware they would face bad weather on the latter half of the journey, they decided to go ahead as planned. One of the guests received a call from her husband this evening, worryingly asking her if it's safe to depart on this hike, even though bad weather is expected. The guest told her husband that the guides are professionals and that she should trust their decision. The next day, July 14th, the group departed at around 6 a.m. The group made good progress this day, traversing 12.5 kilometers, or roughly 8 miles, and arrived at their destination for the day at around 2:30 p.m. They would spend the night in a mountain shack made to house 60 people, so there was more than enough space for everyone to lay down and sleep. When the guides checked the weather forecast, it was again confirmed that tomorrow temperatures would drop and rainfall was expected in the afternoon. They decide to depart early next morning to avoid the bad weather, and everyone goes to sleep at around 6 p.m. When the group arose on July 15th, it had already begun to rain, earlier than forecasts had predicted. The guides instruct everyone to put on their rain gear, and they depart shortly after dawn. The rain had turned the trail into mud, slowing the group down. They had to cover 16 kilometers, or 10 miles to reach their destination for that day, so they only took a few 5-minute breaks to make up for being slowed down by the mud and rain. After 10 hours of continuous marching, they arrived at their destination at around 3 p.m. The guests were exhausted. Keep in mind most of them are well into their 60s. The lack of experience of some of the guests also began to show. Some of them had failed to protect their backpacks from the rain, and as a result their gear, including their sleeping bags, were soaking wet. One of the more veteran guests would later claim, "Ultimately, you are responsible for taking care of yourself on a mountain. I couldn't believe some participants didn't know how important it is to protect your gear from the rain." To make the situation worse, the mountain shack for this night was much smaller than the previous day. This is a picture of the actual shack. Other groups were staying here, making the total number of occupants around 30. The maximum capacity of this shack was said to be about 30 people, but that is the absolute maximum. In reality, it would mean people would have just enough room to lie down side by side. The group would spend the night cramped in this small hut, with insufficient room to dry their clothes, some of them sleeping in sleeping bags soaking wet. The hut itself had leaks in the roof as well, and rain would drip onto the guests throughout the night. They woke up at around 4 a.m. the next day to realize the rain and wind had gotten stronger overnight. It was also considerably colder than the previous 2 days. Some of the guests were surprised when the guides decided they would be departing after dawn. One of them later mentioned that she felt it would be better to take shelter in the hut and descend the next day, but could not speak up due to peer pressure. At around 5:30 a.m., the guides announced they would not be attempting to summit Mount Tomuraushi due to bad weather, and would instead take a detour that goes around the summit. The lead guide mentioned, our main responsibility is not to summit the mountain. It is to get all of you safely off the mountain." This somewhat relieved the worried guests, and the group began preparing to depart. Again, the lack of experience of some of the guests would come into play. Everyone was instructed to put on their rain gear, but there was no clear instructions on what to wear underneath, so some guests only had light clothing under their rain jackets. A guest would later complain that the guides should have told everyone to wear warm layers underneath their rain gear, but others argue it should have been so obvious people should not need to be explicitly told to do so. On top of this, as some people failed to protect their gear from the rain properly the previous day, they would be wearing wet clothing. The group departed at around 5:30 a.m., with winds so strong they would sometimes have to get down on all fours to prevent being knocked over. At 8:30 a.m., the group reaches an area known as the Garden of Rocks. As the name implies, this is a large area covered in boulders, with bad footing, and little to shield yourself from the wind. Some people would get their hats and backpack covers blown off, others would trip. The weaker guests would begin to fall behind and require one of the guides, or one of the more experienced guests to help them, slowing down the group as a whole. The temperature on this day was around 5 degrees Celsius, or 40 degrees Fahrenheit. This might sound extremely cold for a day in July, but keep in mind this is at a somewhat high altitude. However, it was not just the temperature that was an issue. There was the fact that the guests were wet, and the wind on this day was very strong. I'm sure all of you have the experience of stepping out of a shower or a pool on a somewhat chilly day. It feels much colder until you dry yourself off. If you combine being wet with strong winds, it can feel much colder than what the actual temperature may suggest. The toll these conditions took on the hikers would begin to surface as the day went on. At 10 a.m., the group reaches what is known as the North Pond. But what they found wasn't a pond. Due to the rain, this pond had overflown to create a knee-deep river, which they had to cross. 2 guides would stand in the river and support guests as they made their way across. At one point, one of the guides lost his balance and fell into the water, getting drenched literally head to toe. This one mistake would have major consequences, as we will see later on. At 10:30 a.m., everyone had finished crossing, but one of the guests that a guide had pretty much been dragging along began to slip in and out of consciousness. As the guides attempted to revive this guest, the others had to wait nearby for more than an hour, exposed to the wind. One woman would begin mumbling to herself while emitting strange noises. Another would begin vomiting. At around 12 p.m., it was decided that 2 guides would stay behind with 5 guests who were too weak to proceed, and make emergency shelter on the spot, while the other 11 would go down the mountain with the 3rd guide. The guide leading down the 11 people down the mountain begins descending at an alarming speed. One by one, stragglers would begin to fall behind, and not before long, the 11 people were no longer a group. Only one guest was able to keep up with the guide. This guest warns the guide that no one is following, and that he has to slow down. The guide refuses, saying he has to descend as fast as possible to get a cell phone signal so he can call for rescue. This was the guide that fell into the river earlier, and may have already been suffering from hypothermia, which can cloud one's decision-making abilities. The condition of this guide would get worse by the minute. He would periodically collapse, and the one guest that was with him had to encourage the guide to get back on his feet and keep moving. In the early afternoon, this guest got a cell phone signal. She would then call the police and hand the phone over to the guide to have him report the dire situation they were in. But at this point, the guide was already severely hyperthermic, unable to put a single sentence together. So the guest took the phone back and tried her best to describe the current situation and rough location of where she and the rest of the hikers were. However, as this was a very remote location of the mountain range, it would take a while for the police to arrive, and most likely search efforts would not begin until the next day. In the meantime, another guest had caught up, and the 2 guests tried their best to revive the guide, but after 40 minutes or so decided to leave the guide behind and head down. A few other guests would also pass by this guide over the next couple hours, and although they tried their best to help him, after a while they understandably had to prioritize their own lives and left the guide behind. Back near the North Pond, the situation was not any better. A few of the guests had gone cold, and the guides were pitching emergency tents to take shelter for the night. One of the guides was able to get a cell phone signal and sent a message to the tour company's headquarters. "I'm sorry, 7 of us are stuck on the mountain. Requesting rescue. A few guests may not make it." He would also call the police, directly requesting rescue from them as well. At around 6 p.m., members of the police force would arrive near the foot of the mountain, but it was too late to launch a search party as the sun was already going down. Around midnight, 4 guests managed to descend on their own, and before dawn another guest miraculously made it down the mountain, having walked the entire night through the darkness. As soon as the sun rose, police and military teams would begin searching for people still unaccounted for on the mountain. One by one, the remaining hikers are found, in varying conditions. When all was said and done, 8 out of the 15 hikers passed away due to hypothermia, including 1 guide. Surprisingly, it was not the guide who had collapsed while descending. He was found in a state of suspended animation, but somehow managed to make a full recovery. The guide who didn't make it was one of the guides who stayed behind with the guests who were too weak to descend on their own. His tent had blown away during the night, exposing him and 1 guest to the wind and cold, and neither of them made it till dawn. 8 out of 15 people freezing to death during summer is a serious issue, especially considering this was a tour with professional guides. Much scrutiny was put into the case, and a report was created pointing out the major mistakes made by the guides and the tour company as a whole. The first mistake began with the selection of the guides. Out of the 3 guides on this tour, 2 had never been on this route before, and on top of that there was no prior briefing or sharing of information and protocol between them. They pretty much met each other for the first time on the spot, resulting in poor communication and cooperation between the guides. The second mistake was not establishing any requirements for guests participating on the tour. Although this was not a particularly difficult hiking course, considering the group would be walking close to 10 hours a day for 3 days in a row, there should have been prior experience required to participate. The guests' lack of experience would result in some of them getting their gear drenched from the rain, and not wearing proper insulation according to the weather. It was assumed the tour company, Amuse Travel, didn't demand any prior experience so more people could join the tour, and hence they would make more revenue. Finally, the most obvious mistake was the guides deciding not to turn back when the situation began to deteriorate. This was most likely a combination of some of the guides not being familiar with the route, pressure from the company to go through with the tour to not disappoint the guests, and simply miscalculating the risks involved, even though they knew the weather would turn for the worse. Although charges would be pressed against the 2 surviving guides and the president of this company, they ultimately did not face any consequences, as courts ruled there was insufficient grounds to go through with the prosecution. The same tour company, Amuse Travel, would be responsible for yet another hiking disaster a few years later, in which 3 hikers would end up losing their lives traversing the Great Wall of China. But that's a story for another day. As always, thank you for watching until the end. Please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode. I'll see you next time.